Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to tonight's archaeology talk with Dr. Jim Gibb. The title of tonight's talk is Mark Twain at Quarry Farm, Elmira, New York. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. First of all, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Allison, and I work for the St. Mary's County Library System. I'm going to be facilitating tonight's presentation. Let me go ahead and share my screen then.
Welcome, folks. Good to see you. Uh, this is kind of unfortunate we're working from PDF because I have more than the usual number of slides tonight. Uh, but I'm going to go through a lot of them fairly quickly. This is a project in progress, even though the work was done back in 1986 and 87, I think. It's work at Quarry Farm, which was owned by Mark Twain's sister-in-law. But it's where he did a lot of his work. It's where he and his family visited every summer. So change, please. So first I want to introduce a small cast of characters. Um, and then I'll start talking about, there's no kind of overarching theory or anything here or any major hypotheses. This is sort of a study in landscape change and the people who change that landscape. So we start off with Jervis and Olivia Lewis Langdon. They bought this property, Quarry Farm, in 1869 from a fellow who, surprisingly enough, operated a quarry there, a stone quarry. That's the name. Next, please. I don't have many photographs of Susan Langdon Crane, but Jarvis Langdon died in 1870, a year after buying the place. So he bequeathed it to his eldest daughter, Susan. So she's responsible for a lot of the things that happened to Quarry Farm over the course of about 50 years or more. Next, please. So, of course, we have Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, who died in 1920. On the right are his family, his wife, Olivia, and their three daughters. Next, please. These are the folks who inhabited Quarry Farm period in question, so it's good to get to know them. This is the last owner of Quarry Farm, Jarvis Langdon Jr. He shows up in the story on and off. I actually got to know him very briefly. He was the president of several railroad lines. He's a fairly prominent individual. When I knew him, he was in his early 80s, and he used to fly his private plane from Elmira, New York, down to Gibson Island, Maryland, where he would at a retreat where he kind of summer. At the time, I was, I guess, in my 30s, and I was all in awe that this man in his 80s would get in an airplane and just fly down to Maryland. Next, please. And the last character of interest, unfortunately, I don't have any good photographs of him, is Tony Lang. Tony Lang was a professor of anthropology at Elmira College. He's the one who involved me in the project when I was a graduate student. He was a phenomenal guy. Was an award a Purple Heart during the Korean War. Was a prominent professor, excellent teacher. Published a little bit, but he was a very motivating teacher for his students. He died almost 15, dozen years ago. But he's somebody who really should be remembered. Next, please. Okay, Quarry Farm. This map dates to 1853. There was no Langdon Clemens association with the property at the time. It was a fellow named Faustnot. Apparently, he ran a quarry up there where he quarried stone. He was probably doing building contract work, and so he quarried stone as he needed it. But it's kind of northeast of the city of Elmira, looking down on the city. Elmira is just north of the Pennsylvania line, and it's an hour or so west of Binghamton, New York, if that helps. And most of the area around the city was farmland. The city was a pretty up and coming kind of place. Had like a lot of those New York State cities, a lot of manufacturing going on, a lot in the way of transportation with railroads and everything. Fair amount of money in that town. Next, please. Um, so the story really, where we really I got involved in this is that we were looking for the octagonal study, a small study built by Susan Langdon Crane for her brother-in-law in 1874. And this was a place where he can go and write. And it was the incentive for him to bring Susan's sister, Olivia, and their three children up to Quarry Farm for the summer from Hartford, Connecticut. So he'd be able to sit in this nice little cottage, write, be far enough away from the family so he can concentrate, had a beautiful view of the city. But that study was moved down to Elmira College in 1952. So what we were looking for initially was where exactly was the study on the grounds? Next, please. The other site we were looking for was there was a sort of a pavilion, not octagonal, but hexagonal, um, that they call the tent. It's sort of a pavilion where the extended family would get together and enjoy summer evenings and such. So, and this is Mark Twain, Olivia, and their three daughters, and a dog whose name I don't know. Next, please. And this is the Mark Twain most of us sort of know, especially the fellow on the left, without the commencement exercise garb on, but kind of an old man, white hair, often wore linen suits, kind of curmudgeonly, but also always quick with a quip. He was America's foremost humorist, and in fact, the Mark Twain Prize, which is awarded to humorists each year, is of course named for him. Next, please. So Elmira, let's start with that. We've got two kind of oblique views of it. This is a little bit of the city, and what fills the center of the frame is Elmira College. Initially, it was a school for young women, a college for women. Uh, there were a number of these throughout New York State and even down into Maryland, starting in the 1830s. So they suggest that we've got populations that are fairly cosmopolitan. I think it's worth educating women at the college level. In the 1830s, the phrase was educating the future mothers of the future fathers of our nation. So not entirely enlightened, but it was a start. Next, please. And you can get a hold of these photographs at the Library of Congress online if you're interested. Just another view. This one gives you a better sense of the extent of the city in the late 19th century. Next, please. And I have a close-up view or two of the college. The college is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, the field schools we ran, 3-week field schools for Elmira College students were out of the college. And the Mark Twain study had been moved down to the college, and it's still there. You can visit that. But you can see it's a pretty impressive initial building there, kind of masculine looking, actually, very fortress-like. I don't quite know what that was meant to be. Go ahead, next, please. And there again. And it was sitting right above the Chemung River in New York. Next, please. And there's the study. Donated to the college. Moved there, still there. Next, please. You could see, I mean, it's been restored a little bit, but fairly ornate. And this is the house at Quarry Farm, which I'll talk a little bit about because it's changed quite a bit. The house and the grounds were donated to Elmira College in 1982 by Jarvis Langdon Jr. To be used as an institute for Mark Twain studies. Anybody who's up in Elmira thinks, well, maybe I'll go there and visit. Don't. It's just for visiting scholars. It is not a tourist site. They will not admit you. You can go see the study, but you can't go up to Quarry Farm. While I was teaching these 3-week field schools, I actually lived in the house. A friend of mine quipped that, "Oh boy, you got to use Mark Twain's toilet." But next, please. You'll see why that's not exactly true. This is from a historic structures report done just a few years ago, and I've only recently gotten a hold of it, but you could find it online if you like. It's a very detailed study of the house and the grounds and how they've changed. It's pretty well done. But on the left, you could see 1869, 1870. This is the cottage that the original Jervis Langdon had conceived of and I think built. But it was added on to. Susan Langdon did a lot of additions, which you could see 1870s to 1890s on the right. The principal reason she did that again was she was trying to coax her brother-in-law and her sister up to Quarry Farm to stay, for the summer. So they needed a bigger house. Jarvis Langdon the first conceived of this as just sort of a summer retreat because they had a place, a very nice place in town. So this was just a place, a weekend retreat, summer retreat for the family. But he died so soon after getting it. And his eldest daughter, very well, if she's going to have the family over, an extended family, she's going to have to extend the building. And that's what she did. So you can see a couple of stages of construction there. Next, please. And there you could see, that's the final, that's what it looks like, what the floor plan looks like today. The picture on the right I showed you because that's part D, a recent addition. That's the porch. And that porch shows up in a lot of the surviving photographs from Quarry Farm. And C is that little one-story addition off the back quarter of the house. But she changed it quite a bit, expanding it. Next, please. And then you could see E on there has been added. And I think they built up a little bit too. So these are the additions made in the 1920s when Jarvis Langdon Jr.'s father acquired the place. And upon his death, his son got it. Next, please. So a couple of views of the study, the steps, which we found some trace of on the left. And that's Mark Twain looking at his study window on the right. That is clearly a posed shot. They're both posed shots. Most of the historic photographs here are posed shots. But the one on the right was taken in 1903. And at that point, that was his last visit. His wife, Olivia, had recently died. The kids who survived, I think there was only one actually survived, kind of grown up, and there was really no reason for him to go back. So that was the end of his time at Quarry Farm. But it also marks an interesting transition in the landscape of the farm because Susan Langdon Crane, who was running the farm, her husband Theodore died fairly early on too. She turned it into more of a commercial dairy operation. And for those of you who work with the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Lab at CERC, this is a project we're working on now at CERC. We're looking at the dairy farm that was the foundation for the research facility. Susan Langdon Crane was operating a dairy, a scientific dairy, at about the time, a little bit earlier than our guy, Robert Lee Forrest. Next, please. Another couple of shots. Again, these are posed. These are the later years. The way I read the photograph on the left is it's starting to grow up a little bit, getting a little weedy maybe, because it was not much used by 1903. Next, please. Mark Twain and John Lewis. John Lewis is interesting because one of the structures we found on the just off the property may have been part of a house for him. Remains to be demonstrated. We did a little bit of excavation around it, but 2-3 week field schools, you don't learn a whole lot. Next, please. This picture, although it's kind of grainy, kind of fuzzy, is interesting because it gives you a sense of the view from the study down to Elmira. The architectural historians and some other art historians have looked at the house and they call it's in the picturesque style. But the landscape isn't what we would call picturesque. It isn't full of, trees and running, waterfalls and sort of stuff we associate with the Hudson River painters of the early 19th century. What Mark Twain would have looked out over was a very prosperous city, but also lots of well-kept farmland, not a lot of forest. And it's that well-kept farmland, mostly dairy and grains to feed dairy. That was kind of the pride of New York in the late 19th century. Farmers entered competitions for who had the best kept farm, as well as, who produced the most and the quality of their production. So it really isn't so much picturesque in terms of landscape, only in the architecture, which is, got a lot of elements added to it to make it kind of interesting, but no real rhyme or reason to, not one of the academic styles of architecture like Greek Revival. Next, please. And this is in 1952, Dalrymple and Company picking up the study and moving it downhill. I got to tell you, I spent a lot of time working in New York and on Eastern Long Island too. Houses, never mind little studies like this, houses were picked up and moved all the time. If you had a good house, but you wanted a different place for it, you kind of jacked it up and got some rollers under it, and you just kind of rolled it down the road. It's kind of weird. Next, please. Just another view of it, about a quality photograph of the study on wheels. Next, please. I'm not sure why I put that one back in. You can skip it. And this is the dedication ceremony at Elmira College. Ida Langdon was another one of Mark Twain's sister-in-laws. She was a professor of English at Elmira College for many years. She was a well-loved instructor at the institution. Next, please. This is a recent aerial view of Quarry Farm. So you can see the road heading off to the northeast on the right-hand side. That's Crane Road. And you can see a couple of structures there. That's the house and several outbuildings, a barn. What I wanted to point out, though, is that this area was, I mean, a lot of it was still cultivated, but it was beginning to reforest. Next, please. In 1964, fairly late in this whole story, there's a lot of the area around Elmira was in cultivation. So the economy there, as in elsewhere throughout the eastern United States, was changing. A lot of smaller farms were closing down, being subdivided for houses, or just left to reforest. Next, please. A quarry. This is a quarry edge. You can see the kind of stone, especially the far right-hand corner. You can see some of the blockier stuff that they were after. It's a sedimentary formation. It's been metamorphosed. It's been hardened and altered. But the softer, crumbly stuff, would just be tossed downhill. And along the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, those are all tailings. That's the rubble that's being discarded. And what they're after are the larger blocks of stone, which were used all over the area in the city and in the countryside for construction. So there are a lot of these things located throughout New York, Pennsylvania, I imagine a good part of Western Maryland too, where builders would go out and, they'd buy some land, they would quarry their own stone. So they're not huge quarries, they're just big enough to fill their construction needs. Next, please. These are the steps that go up to where Mark Twain's study was. This is above the quarry face, just above the quarry face. Next, please. Uh, it's a black and white photograph, and actually a number of the images will come from black and white photographs and from 35 millimeter Kodachrome slides. So bear with me. So this is some of the field school. The first year we were out there excavating, basically clearing the area where the study was located, trying to find the foundation. The woman on the far left, Gretchen, I don't remember her last name offhand. She was actually the administrative assistant for the curator at the place at the time. Next, please. Look at the size of that tailings pile. And again, you can see off to the left, you can see in the distance, you can see the city. But look at all the forest that's coming up. All this is new growth. Uh, I would hazard a guess that any tree you could see there isn't more than 6 inches in diameter. Next, please. A view from the front of the house. You don't get the sense of the height there, but you get a sense of the panoramic view. And keep in mind, a lot of those trees have been allowed to grow up since the early 20th century. My guess is there would have been a lot fewer of them. Next, please. And this is a pretty good view of the house as Mark Twain would have seen it and experienced it. There's a porch there that is kind of heavily overgrown with vines, but that was intentional. It might have been wisteria or something like that. It's not that the place was going to seed. It was very well kept. But that's the picturesque um, house that architectural historians and art historians describe. There's a cupola on top. It looks like it was set up as a ventilator, which you often find on barns. You don't typically find them on houses, but it may have had a function aside from aesthetics. Next, please. This is a view of, actually, this is from the tent, I think. Looking downhill, and you can see the study just off, just within the hoop of vines. The photograph has been damaged, so it's not great looking. And because of the technology of the day, you really can't see Elmira. Next, please. This is the tent, and it looks like it might have gone through a couple of iterations that they finally put a sort of a permanent shingle roof on it. But it's hexagonal, not octagonal, and it had canvas walls that could be rolled down in case of rains. Anybody who's been in that part of New York knows when those thunderstorms come rolling down those valleys, they're wicked. But it's hexagonal, six-sided, and it has a central post that holds up the ceiling. Next, please. Oh, there's my first crew at Elmira College in front of the study. Get a load of that guy on the right. Handsome young buck, isn't he? Next, please. A damaged slide, unfortunately, but the interior of the study. He had a sort of not a cot, but sort of a lounge in there. He had a desk with a couple of a rocking chair. It was really made very nice and pleasant for him again to make it more attractive. You can even see a couple of statuettes on top of the mantle. Nice little fireplace. The Clemens were usually around sometime in March through September. September in New York, it often starts getting a bit chilly, at least in the evening and the morning. And in March, certainly it's downright cold. Next, please. So here's a couple of things we were looking for and found. At the bottom is this foundation for the study. That wasn't hard to find. Gretchen pointed that out to us. A large well, which I'll get to in a few minutes, and then the tent up above. I wasn't there the day the field school was out looking for the tent site. But I got a call. They said, Jim, we found the post holes for the tent. And I was thinking, well, how could you have done that much excavating to have uncovered 6 post holes? And I got up there and I found, in fact, what they did was they cleared away the vegetation and the post holes were still evident as divots in the ground. They weren't hard to find. I didn't have to dig for them. Next, please. So here's the crew at work measuring, doing some measurements for mapping the foundation for the study. Remember, the study had been removed 30 odd years earlier, but it was still pretty easy to find, mostly because the steps leading up to it were still visible. Next, please. So here's a close-up view of what we recorded for the study foundation, as well as the top step leading up to it. And on the right is the tent, which for the most part is a abstract drawing because, again, we didn't actually excavate the post holes. We just mapped in the divots and a roughly 2 foot by 2 foot slab of stone in the middle that would have supported the central post for the tent. Next, please. I don't remember why I put that back in there. Well, let's see what the next slide. So this is what the tent site looked like when after the guys had cleared it off. I think that's the tent site. Maybe it's the study site. Can't tell. Next, please. And here's the tent site. So you can see the abstract figure on the left. On the right, you obviously can't see the post holes, but you could see that 2 foot by 2 foot stone slab. So the point in looking for these things, I mean, we know they existed. We have photographs, but we didn't really know is exactly where they're located. And confession time here, we still don't know exactly where they're located because at the time, there were short field sessions, and we didn't have the technologies to do the large-scale landscape mapping that we have today. We didn't have GPS. Total stations were around, but I certainly didn't have one. So I kind of need to go back, at least with the GPS, to go to these sites and get them accurately mapped. Not sure when that'll happen. Next, please. As you can see, this is a summer field session, and it gets hot up there too, and buggy, as the young lady in front is, I think, demonstrating. Unusual photograph. This is probably the last time I've allowed anybody working on a site without a shirt on. Next, please. Down in front of the house and where the barn are, we actually found other structures that I suspect date or are part of the farm operation. The artifacts that we've collected were cataloged by the students, and I have their catalog. Unfortunately, it's really quite useless. I can't use it to date anything. It's too vague. So the collections are down at Elmira College. At some point, somebody needs to look at them, preferably me, and catalog them properly and see if we can determine the dates and functions of the several buildings we found there. Next, please. Just another excavation shot. You could see that building we just looked at is just beyond that young man, upper left-hand corner. One of the neat things about working in central New York is there's no dearth of stone. And so finding structures could be fairly easy. Looking for earth-fast structures as we do in Maryland, with wooden posts just set into the ground. These things are relatively easy to find, and in most cases just below the sod line. In the uplands of New York, there's not a lot of soil development. Next, please. Just a closer view. And a lot of them are kind of rubbly looking. You find big stones and you tend to find a lot of little stuff jammed in between. But then again, you'll find as where that trowel is, undisturbed subsoil. So the contrast is very easy to follow. Next, please. There's Tony Lang again, another one of the structures. That's the house off to the left, upper left-hand corner. So what we're looking for, what we're looking at, are a series of stone foundations between roughly the house and the barn that survives. Next, please. Further afield, and it turns out not actually on the Quarry Farm property that Elmira College owns, there are a couple of stone chimney stacks. This one we think, although the evidence isn't great, this one we think is for Ellerslie, which is essentially a playhouse for the children. Next, please. Looking something like this, but in the photograph, you could just barely make out a stovepipe emerging from the ridgeline of the house. But you don't see anything more substantial. It may just be that it's hidden. I don't know. Next, please. A lot of excavating around. I don't think I have a drawing in this one, but extensive foundation. So it's clearly um, something of substance. It's not a barbecue. Next, please. So there it is again on the right. On the left, even further off the property, further away from the house, is a stacked stone, mortared stacked stone chimney, which people have regarded as kind of an outdoor barbecue sort of thing, but it just looks like a fireplace to me. Reputed to have belonged to John T. Lewis, who we saw earlier in that 1903 photograph standing next to Mark Twain. He's old enough that very likely, I don't know his history, but very likely he was a slave prior to emancipation. And this may have been a house that the Cranes had built for him. Next, please. This is a really kind of neat structure. And for those working on Robert Lee Forest at Cirque, it's interesting. You can't tell from this particular image, but we're up against the quarry face. And what the students are uncovering is a large foundation, elliptical in shape. Next, please. More of them at work. And off to the right, you could see sort of, it looks like it's probably a stone slab, but it looks like a small well excavated, sort of a pump. Because this thing turns out to be a large well or cistern. Next, please. There you have it. You can see this large oval type structure. It would have been open and filled with water right up against the quarry face. And water was being pumped out. When it was built, we're not sure whether or not it was there during Mark Twain's tenure up to about 1903, or if it was built by Susan Crane for her dairy operation. Next, please. Clearly, they're pumping water out of it. And even on the other side, you can see a pump. Well, that might be for a drilled well. But it was all filled with rubble. Next, please. That student is digging an awful big hole there, and we're screening it. What you can't see from here is a lot of it is coal ash. Next, please. Yeah, you can see the profile. So, that's just the fill, the ash fill. How much deeper this thing went, I don't know. We never had the opportunity to take it down deeper. Next, please. I'll show you a couple of artifacts that came out of there in a moment. So this is sort of the kind of core of the house lot. You can see the house off in the right-hand side of the picture. The existing barns. They were cultivating the land here, but it was gardens for the family. And when I was there in the 1980s, a small portion of it was still cultivated. They had a couple of asparagus beds and a strawberry bed planted. And I was there at just the right time of the year. I would walk out of the house, go to the asparagus bed, cut some asparagus, bring it right back in the house and steam it up. It was really quite nice. But I think that's all they were growing at the time that I recall. When I was there in the 80s, there was a young couple who were sort of caretakers, but nobody was living in the house. They did have college guests stay there from time to time. My second time there, I was booted out of the house over the weekend. I had to go back to Binghamton because they were putting up, I think it might be Hal Roach or somebody from Hollywood. who was giving a commencement speech and presumably getting an honorary degree. So yeah, I got kicked out. Next, please. So here's just, an example of some of the structures, we didn't have to dig for. They're right on the surface, but it takes time to explore these things, try to figure out when they were built, what they were used for. This structure for this foundation is clearly an addition, so it's not part of the original barn. And so we might ask, well, why did they put this addition on? What was its purpose? What occurred that prompted them to do that? And you can see in the left-hand side, it looks like there's a bulkhead entranceway there. And it may be that this is a structure that basically kept the rain out, provide access into the lower part of the barn. I don't know. It's been 40 years for one thing, and we didn't really have time to explore it. Next, please. Ah, this was out of sequence. This is the profile of that trench in that large cistern. You could see it's all ashy, coal ash. So it became a convenient place to dump stuff. But that means if they're dumping coal ash into that, essentially that overgrown well, almost a swimming pool, that means they weren't using it anymore. So now the question is, well, when did they stop using it? Next, please. We found some stuff in it, a couple of bottles that date to early 20th century. They really weren't all that helpful, or at least I don't have the information on them in hand that would make them helpful. Could be that if we look at them today, we might get some very specific dates off them. But the nails are typical for around the turn of the 20th century, wire nails, machine cut nails. They're not helpful. Next, please. This is helpful. This is a machine produced by the Crown Cork and Seal Company of Baltimore, New York. It might still be around, I don't know. But they used, all those old style caps on pop bottles you'd take off with the round end of a church key. It had a cork lining. That was these guys. So here we've got a piece of their machinery that came out of that cistern. What's that doing in there? Next, please. This is what it was doing in there. These are metal bottle caps from Quarry Farm Dairy, S.L. Crane, proprietor. And there's even a date on it, Saturday. So it tells you what day of the week. It says Elmira, New York. It's certified. Apparently, I haven't researched this yet, but Susan Crane was involved in a organization that dealt with manufacturing, distributing clean milk. At the time, this is 1890s to 1920 or so, there was a great hue and cry about adulterated milk, so unethical people watering down the milk before selling it. But there was also a major issue with bovine tuberculosis. So bottling clean milk and eventually pasteurizing it were major issues at the time. This is part of the progressive movement of roughly 1890 up through about World War I. Susan Crane was involved in all that. Again, a nice parallel with our Robert Lee Forrest at Cirque. On the right-hand side, of course, is your classic well pump. It was found within, but that shows that thing, that cistern likely was covered. I'll be damned if I know with what. It may have had a frame structure on it. I don't know. But clearly it was closed up because you needed a pump to pump clean water out for household use and probably for use in the dairy barn. Next, please. And the final cast of characters, see if I can remember their names. Quarry is the collie. I don't remember the Rottweiler. And the little one below is Nelson. That's Tony Lang's dog. They were constant companions out at the site. Obviously, as you might imagine, they're long dead, as is Jervis Langdon, who owned the two big dogs. But they kept things light around the site, kept the students amused. I think that's the last slide.
Looks like there's one more.
All right, well, let's see it. Must be good. Oh, the 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 of course the final crew shot. I think this was our second. Yeah, this was our second field school. I think we had 5 or 6 the first one, and you can see how many we have here. I don't seem to be in the photograph, so I must be taking it. Um, but yeah, with a field school, we were able to do some interesting stuff, introduce students to what we call landscape archaeology. So they get to look at, and we actually spent a lot of time walking, taking the students on hikes uphill. This is not even the top of the hill. It's a very steep hill to get up to Quarry Farm, and it's steeper yet going up. Uh, but I would take them through the woods, and we would look at different features, cultural features, tree growth, and so they would learn a little bit about how to read a landscape and how to understand how that landscape has changed. And for me, that's one of the more important things we could teach folks from archaeology is that the landscape they see today is not the landscape that was there 20, 50, 100, 200, 1,000 years ago, that it's changed, in this case, mostly by the actions of humans. Um, but yeah, it's just taking and showing them the impact of people on the land and how there's a story to tell just from that changing landscape. Hopefully, eventually, I'll get back to this project and put pieces together. It is my one sin in archaeology, the one project I've never written up. So that's the end. You can now criticize me for not having written it up. Take your punches one at a time.
Does anyone have any questions?
While you were talking, Jim, Crown Cork and Seal is still in business, and it's a Fortune 500 company. Their
All
headquarters
right.
in Yardley, Pennsylvania.
Should I buy stock?
Don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, they were big. And Baltimore, of course, was a big manufacturing town. It's hard to uh, conceive of that today. We think of it more as a port town and of residents and large service industry and that sort of thing. But it was a big manufacturing town with a lot of innovation, and that was certainly one of them. The Coke bottle, as we know it, the Owens type bottle, was patented, I don't know, 1903, 1908, something like that. And it basically pushed every other bottle type out of the market over the next few years. And apparently there are still Coca-Cola bottling machines that are still being used after many decades down in South America, so I'm told. So they're really robust, but you need that machine to cap the bottle. Owens, uh, Crown, Cork, and Seal didn't make the bottles, they made the caps. But apparently they made milk caps too.
Hmm.
And I hope, as we do some work on campus, I'm kind of hoping we'll find some dairy caps that say Java Farm, RL Forest Proprietor, certified milk. Anything else? I don't suppose any of you have even been to Elmira.
I've been close. Binghamton.
Yeah. It's one of those, New York State cities that were major economic engines, fell on hard times and began picking up again. But we had a lot of major firms starting there, IBM, Singer Link, just Johnson Shoes. Johnson Shoes is gone. Fairbanks Scale, also gone from Binghamton, gone completely. Major manufacturing places. I'm amazed that sometimes if you go into a junk store, you pick up something like some kitchen utensil and you look on it, it'll say something like made in Binghamton, New York.
Yeah.
And obviously those things hadn't been made in many years, but it's not unusual to see something like that.
I think I must have drove right through that area before because I see Watkins Glen State Park just to the north, and I've been there.
Yeah,
So
now
I probably rode right through there.
yeah, you probably, I don't remember how we used to get up there. you probably head north from Binghamton towards Ithaca before you head off to Watkins Glen. I have done some archaeology up there. But I never found a reason to go through Elmira except for the fact that I was doing some field schools there. And I've been up Canandaigua, most of the Finger Lakes area doing archaeology, and I never went via Elmira. North of it through Horseheads.
Uh, I've heard of Horseheads. I forget what Horseheads is famous for.
Horseheads, apparently, I don't know.
They show
I
a picture
say-
of vintage vehicles. Maybe they have a vintage car show.
No, it was called the Horseheads long before there were automobiles. As I recall it vaguely, it was a story about a whole bunch of horses having
Horses
been
dying.
buried there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
But I forget why.
yeah. Anyway, it had nothing to do with Mark Twain.
So at Quarry Farm, which of his works were said to have been done there?
Huckleberry Finn,
Ah,
parts of Tom Sawyer, a whole bunch of them. A lot of his major works he did at least in part there. It was just a good place for him to write. A lot of his other non-novels also, all or parts of them written there. It was a very productive place for him. There's an extensive uh, amount of material available on him. Elmira College has a huge archive. At Quarry Farm, they have a library. A lot of stuff might be online now. There's biographies. I think Justin Kaplan um, was a biographer. So there's a lot of material. Even if you go on the website and look around at the college and whatnot, you'll see extensive transcriptions. So we have a lot. What hasn't happened is we haven't had an archaeologist carefully paw through all those documents and look for references to landscape features of Quarry Farm, and then look at how, once we find those spots, how Mark Twain experienced them. What did he say about them? And we know he said a lot about the study and about the tent. And about the view from up there. But I'm not a Mark Twain scholar. There's just too much material there for me to chunk through. But it's worth, I think there was an excavation, another summer field school a year or two after me. I haven't seen their report. I think they've written one. But it would make sense to go up there and spend a couple solid months doing some serious archaeology after pouring through all those documents. I think there's some interesting research.
Are those documents digitized?
Well, some of them are. I know in the historic structures report, they've reproduced the land title, the plat, couple of letters, or they have abstracted letters. So, yeah, there's some of it available.
That would be a good AI kind of project to kind of sort through some of that to see where you need to look.
Yeah, true enough. But you'd have to peruse them all first to get some sense of how you would search them. That's a neat kind of project that could be done by somebody with an interest in archaeology, if they could do it online without actually being there, to sort of set up a rationale for going back and doing some additional work. Any other questions, comments, criticisms? This is the first of our season. I'll be back the end of next month. I don't recall what I'm talking about, but
I'm going to post the link in the chat. So
okay.
next month's presentation is on Monday, October 28th, and it's called R.L. Forrest, Dairy Farmer, Citizen Scientist, Philanthropist.
Well, the Robert Lee Forrest research team better get to work getting me some images. We have a huge amount of material, and we're looking at producing some publications real soon, more for general public at this point. So, yeah, stay tuned. It'll be the first time we roll out the research on Robert Lee Forrest, so it should be pretty interesting. This is a guy who had a lot in common with James Smithson, who in the 1840s, I think, bequeathed his fortune for the purpose of developing a Smithsonian institution in Washington, D.C. He was a Brit. But there are a lot of parallels between those two guys, so stay tuned. Okay, well, thank you very much. I will see you guys next month or in the trenches.